This is episode 13 of The Coin Pod, and I'm your host, Zach Bull. Thanks for listening. Journalists who report on and opine about developments in the Bitcoin space are perennially controversial figures, as they are in any other area of news. But the complex, rapidly evolving, and somewhat eclectic nature of truly understanding Bitcoin causes some users to place an extraordinarily high burden of criticism on journalists covering Bitcoin. Other users are simply grateful for easy-to-understand, even if not characteristically accurate, coverage of cryptocurrencies via CNBC, MSNBC, Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. For this episode, I caught up with Kyle Torpey, contributor to Forbes, Motherboard, Business Insider, the Bitcoin Magazine, and more about journalism and Bitcoin. Without further delay, here's Kyle. Thanks so much for coming on the show today, Kyle. Looking forward to chatting with you. Thanks for making the time. This should be a lot of fun.
Thanks for having me.
Before we jump into journalism, you first used Bitcoin in, early 2011 or so, and then 3 years later, Bitcoin became your full-time profession. Can you tell me a little bit about what pushed you over the edge, all those years ago now, to go full-time into Bitcoin?
Yeah, sure. I think like most people, when they read about Bitcoin for the first time, I thought it was stupid and I didn't think it could work. And so I got curious into finding the reason as to why it didn't work. And I think a lot of people do that and they go oh, it can't work for this. And then you go on the Bitcoin Talk forums. I guess today it would be Reddit, but back then everyone was just on Bitcoin Talk. So you would go in there and be oh guys, this can't work because of this. And then someone would come in and explain, actually, no, you're wrong. And, it is secure for this reason, or it can work for this reason, or whatever. But yeah, I found, I think I had heard something about it before, but then I really got interested when I read the Gawker article in, I think it was summer 2011, I want to say, where it was about the Silk Road, and it was about Bitcoin and Tor and how people are, going online and buying drugs on the internet. So I got fascinated by that because I didn't think it could work, just like Bitcoin itself. And then I was only interested in it as a cool thing that people are using to get around, the regulations, or basically just buy drugs on the internet and do stuff like that. Or, WikiLeaks donations were, another story at the time. And I didn't really think of it as a useful investment or anything like that until I think it was end of 2012, early 2013. I kind of realized there is, because I was kind of a gold bug before Bitcoin, and I kind of fell into the camp. There was this big debate back in, those camps in the early days, Bitcoin, does it have intrinsic value? Does that matter? And I was kind of in the camp of, I don't think this can really be a useful investment or have any value because, it's just magic internet money or something like that. Then once I realized, I put two and two together of the uncensorable monetary policy and the fact that you can do transactions that you can't do with something like e-gold or any fiat currency on the internet. And I kind of viewed that as the base fundamental value proposition, which, some people call it intrinsic value. I just call it, I don't really know what to call it, but I guess I'll just use intrinsic value as a placeholder.
And I guess since then, since 2011 or 2014, you've been writing and researching, and I guess also sort of acting as a human RSS feed for anything worth knowing about Bitcoin and other altcoins for anyone who's interested in those. And people who are in a similar profession, journalists, I guess, broadly speaking, covering Bitcoin are frequently just wrong about their opinions, their factual descriptions about developments in the space. And that's sort of the meat of what I want to chat with you about for this episode. Why, in your opinion, are journalists so frequently wrong about Bitcoin? Is it a product of Bitcoin's moderately steep learning curve, or a more or less industry-wide obstinacy to mastering this technology, and maybe it's supporting ideologies too? Why is this such a widespread problem?
I think it is, you kind of hit the nail on the head. It is the steep learning curve, I think, because even like I said, when I first looked at Bitcoin, I thought it was stupid and couldn't work. And then I was I think a lot of people, even myself, go into it with like this arrogance of that you know what it is, and you really, I've never researched or looked into anything where that saying that you don't what you don't know is what I forget what the saying is. It's like you don't know what you don't know or something like that. And I think that I've never run into something where that's like such a accurate statement than with Bitcoin, because there's just such a deep rabbit hole, and you have like all these aha moments every now and then as you keep going further down. So I think it is mostly the steep learning curve. I'm sure I probably wrote some like terrible articles when I started as well. But my background is also not journalism. I was doing like search engine optimization stuff before I got into Bitcoin. So I came into this from like a different perspective than most of the people that were writing for like the mainstream press, I guess. And I just kind of like, I probably did a horrible job for the first 6 months or a year, but then I just kind of like learned how to do it as I went along. And I tried to, once you have a few of those moments where you're like, you have those aha moments where you realize something in Bitcoin works completely different than you thought it was, you just become like a much more humble over time. And you just try to be, more cautious in the statements that you're putting in your articles. But I mean that the other thing it made me think about is that like, since if Bitcoin's like a topic that you know a lot about, or you can like pick out all the flaws in like mainstream press with Bitcoin, there's like no reason to think they aren't doing the same thing with like every other topic. And that's kind of like a sad like realization that I came to eventually.
I agree. Their inadequacy or their lack of accurate coverage, more often than not, it seems, Bitcoin is not a problem unique to Bitcoin per se. It's something that bleeds into political, financial, social news coverage, and op-ed writing and all that sort of thing. And I think journalists' deficient understanding of Bitcoin, or actually, I'm curious to know your opinion, but I think that many journalists' deficient understanding of Bitcoin plays a significant role in the boring, repetitive talking points and criticisms of Bitcoin that we see year after year. It's just the same content over and over again. Perhaps if they took the time to understand Bitcoin a little bit more, the thing they're actually critiquing, the general conversation, could progress to more substantial critiques. Do you agree? Or like, why do we keep seeing the same tired, old, worn-out talking points and criticisms from these professional journalists who are supposed to have reasonably well-informed opinions on Bitcoin over and over again?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. It was just it was either 2 or 3 days ago when a guy from, he was like the founding CEO of PayPal, Bill Harris, but he hasn't been there since like 2000. And he came out with this op-ed for Recode about how Bitcoin's like the biggest scam ever. So I wrote a response to that piece for Forbes, but I've basically written that article like probably a dozen or maybe more times over the past like 3 or 4 years, but it was like the same arguments over and over again. So it didn't even like I just like went through, I was like, oh, I've seen this one before, and like already had the responses ready. But in terms of why that kind of thing keeps happening, I think it's just kind of goes into what I said to before with, the low quality of journalism you see with Bitcoin is kind of prevalent all the time. You just usually don't realize it unless you're reading about a topic that you fully understand. So there are some places that have done good coverage, and I think you can kind of use Bitcoin coverage as like a proxy for the quality of their overall form of journalism, or any other topic that you're like very familiar with. So I think like Bloomberg especially has done a pretty decent job for a long time. I remember even back in like 2013 or 2014, they did like a week of Bitcoin or something with Matt Miller, and he would just come on and like he was basically just like trying out Bitcoin and doing downloading wallets and going around and trying to buy stuff with Bitcoin. Outside of them, I haven't seen, obviously in like the complete opposite direction. It seems like CNBC is like, I guess a lot of people already knew this, but I haven't watched like CNBC a lot, but it's just like the entertainment BuzzFeed of financial journalism. It seems like just from I mean, when the best example is when like Brian Kelly told everyone how to buy Ripple like at the peak, and uh, but yeah, that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it seems like most of the content CNBC is producing now would be more fitting if it came from a BuzzFeed crypto news desk or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, Journalists, pundits, reporters, and anyone else publishing content, in my opinion, should bear some sort of responsibility to their audience to admit when they're wrong. And for blatant factual errors, some Bitcoin journalists and reporters do correct themselves. But for more opinion-oriented content, Bitcoin critics or Bitcoin agnostics don't really readily admit when they're wrong, usually because they don't really have a standard for when their theories, which I guess maybe more appropriately should be labeled like hysterical dogma, can actually be proven wrong. And the one counterexample to this that stands out is Kevin Roos from the New York Times, the article he wrote in December, Why I Was Wrong About Bitcoin, or I Was Wrong About Bitcoin, Here's Why, something to that effect. And he was hardcore against Bitcoin 2013, I believe it was. He bought a couple things with it, tried it out, and said, yeah, this is going to fail. And then he said, I'm wrong. And no one else really says that. I'm just curious to know your thoughts on the sort of dogmatic approach to Bitcoin by some of these journalists rather than a more balanced, and I want to get into bias in a minute, but sort of a more balanced, even-keeled, level-headed approach to it. And if you think we'll ever see, I mean, I'm borderline perma-bull on Bitcoin, but if we'll ever see any more of these articles coming out, hey, yeah, I was wrong about Bitcoin, I hated it before, but I mean, it's kind of catching on, sort of thing. Do you think we'll see any more of that in the future, like this Kevin Roos article?
I actually got a lot of flack for an article I wrote for Forbes where I like updated it, I think 3 or 4 times. And some of it wasn't like even factual errors. It was just like me adding additional information and that kind of thing too. And they were like, "Oh, you didn't even get your information right. Don't you know anything about Bitcoin?" That kind of thing. But then Balaji, the Earn.com CEO, now he's at Coinbase, sent out a tweet that was like congratulating me for like being honest enough to like go back and add stuff in, or I mean, there I think 1 or 2 of them were like factual mistakes too that I corrected. And I do always try to do that in all my work, just because like that is what that's what you're supposed to do. Like if people were saying that was a horrible thing that I did to go back and update it 4 times, but the reality is most people won't do that at all. And then just like the bad information is sitting there forever on the internet. And yeah, that doesn't happen very often, especially when it comes to like the opinions, as we're pointing out, like people that are probably on the Bitcoin Obituaries website. I'm not sure what percentage of them have admitted they were wrong yet, but it's probably very low. Another one I do remember was either Joe Weisenthal or the other guy, the CEO of Business Insider. It was when Weisenthal was at Business Insider at the time, but he wrote like this big takedown of Bitcoin, and then like 6 months later or something, he was like, well, maybe I'm wrong. But yeah, there isn't a lot of that out there. They do kind of, well, obviously, like especially the Bitcoin skeptics, they like to, like when after the price went up like from under 1,000 to almost 20,000 over 2017, they didn't say anything at all basically the whole time. And then as soon as the price crashes down to like 10,000, or even maybe it was still higher than that at the time, they're like, oh, see, we're right. We said it was a bubble at like, or some of them would say it was a bubble like even before $100. And then the price goes from like 19,000 to 10,000. They're like, oh, see, we're right. But obviously, like they missed out on like 100x or more gains still during that time. I think there was another part of your question too, but I'm not sure if I covered it all.
No, you did. I'm just sort of curious why they don't correct themselves. You sort of answered it, and I think a lot of the criticisms, I mean, during the most recent bubble over end of 2017, I think there may have been moderate coverage on, hey, this is definitely a bubble, we're going to be right in a couple months, and then they sort of had the haha told you so moment when it collapsed.
Well, it's funny because even the Bitcoiners were like, yeah, this is probably a bubble, and like so we were right too.
And I think the reason that we sort of like both sides sort of agreed on that is because in my mind, not to necessarily exclude anyone, but in my mind, the true, real, hardcore hodler Bitcoiners, any day of the week, no matter what the price is, will tell you, hey, yeah, the price is the least interesting part of Bitcoin, hands down. And if we saw these critics who are harping on the fact that it's a bubble and just price, price, price all day long, if they actually covered some of the more technical or monetary theoretical aspects of Bitcoin, that could provide a little bit more interesting content to argue back and forth about, rather than, hey, Bitcoin is up and it's up a lot and then it's going to go down a lot. Okay, it went down a lot. Now we're right. You're wrong. Bitcoin is a failure. That sort of like meaningless minutia dialogue.
Actually, one other thing I should point out here is how I think Paul Krugman's most recent comments, and he's just been like wrong. I mean, he was writing about Bitcoin like before I was. I think one of my first pieces, it was actually I was like, I went through his articles and pointed out some of the flaws. But like I think it was his most recent one. I don't know if he's written or talked about it since then. He said, he was like, I was right about the bubble, but this is like maybe a bubble that can't pop because there's no like reason for it to pop, because there's no like, you can't see that it's overvalued. Really, it's not like the, housing collapse where you can see all of these people defaulting on their loans. There's no like revenue stream or like profit loss mechanism or any of that in Bitcoin. So he's like, well, there's no reason for this to pop. So maybe it's a bubble that will just keep going forever. So it's kind of a way for him to like still be right, I guess. He's like, it's a bubble, but it's not going to pop.
Yeah, sort of moving the goalposts indefinitely into the future. I don't know.
Yeah.
Before we move into sort of bias in covering Bitcoin, I'm curious if you can name a journalist or two who covers Bitcoin, with whom you usually or entirely disagree with their opinions and takes on cryptocurrency in general and Bitcoin specifically, but who you still highly respect their writing and opinions and the quality of their journalism?
That's a good question. I used to read, my answer probably a year or two ago and further back would be Tim Swanson in this question all the time. But some of his stuff these days, I found it like less agreeable, or there's just like back in the day he would have like more, he was kind of just like going after the Bitcoin like cult, if you want to call it like that, and just being like just bringing some reality into the situation, which is always needed. Kind of like the Bitcoin Uncensored guys used to do when they had their podcasts and everyone was like in the euphoric decentralize all the things, and then they were really the ones that were like, well, you don't need to like decentralize everything. So yeah, I think they got credit for that, and they were like CoinDesk's one of the most influential people or something that one year. But other than Tim Swanson these days, Francis Coppola's stuff is decent sometimes, but more recently, I've gotten back and forth with her on Twitter regarding the Lightning Network, and her arguments don't really make sense to me there. And we've kind of just stopped engaging because we just get back to the same points, and it's just like, well, I guess we'll agree to disagree. Maybe the best is Isabella Kaminska from FT. But yeah, I mean, there's with that kind of stuff, you have to realize like they're going to get a lot of stuff wrong, but as long as they're making some points that make sense every now and then, that's really the best you're going to do usually. I don't think there's someone out there that's like consistently writing about Bitcoin and making great points against it all the time, at least from what I've seen.
Now, sort of shifting gears here from the quality of covering Bitcoin to bias writing about Bitcoin. Writing about Bitcoin while owning Bitcoin is one of, I guess, many favorite critiques for so-called no-coiner journalists to lob against pro-Bitcoin writers. And I guess, in my opinion, this is at best a secondary or tertiary concern to actually understanding the thing you're writing about, whether you're for it or against it, which many pro-Bitcoin journalists do, not surprisingly or coincidentally. I have a couple specific questions, but I just sort of want to lead off with, what's your take on owning the stuff you're writing about, and even for some columnists, pundits being paid in Bitcoin while writing about Bitcoin. Do you see this as sort of like categorically problematic or categorically not problematic whatsoever, or maybe a gray area, middle ground in between the two?
Yeah, it's kind of a difficult situation because, I mean, from what I can tell, the people who know the most about Bitcoin are the ones that are either trading it all day or just holding it because they have the biggest incentive to learn as much as possible as they can about it, which is why they made their investment in the first place. Um, so there, I mean, if there's going to be this inherent bias, whether you hold it or not, if you're not holding it, you're probably, I mean, if you thought it was a good idea, you would hold it and then you wouldn't be able to write about it. If you agree with that like philosophy that you shouldn't write about what you hold, um, I think that's basically my take on it. Like if you look at some of the even like the Twitter accounts or like the well-known like anonymous traders like Whale Panda or people like that, like they're some of the most knowledgeable people in the space, and obviously they're holding a ton of or they're holding some Bitcoin at least. Um, so I think there's like an overlap between the holders know the most about Bitcoin, which is why that's why they bought it.
One of the more vocal opponents, or I guess critics, of journalists who hold Bitcoin is Michael Del Castillo. He wrote an article for LinkedIn last year, and he basically said, I have the quote pulled up here somewhere. And with cryptocurrency, journalists should know how it works, but not own it. And sort of going to what you were just saying, that buying, storing, exchanging, and otherwise using the thing itself is the best way, or one of the best ways, I should say, to know how it works. And this opinion in particular seems well-intentioned, but pretty impractical and misinformed. Do you disagree?
Yeah, I think I remember agreeing with that piece when he wrote it actually. Um, but I forget like the specifics of it. Because I did think it made sense to, I understood the argument to not hold Bitcoin and not be able to write about it. I'd have to go back and like read that specific piece though, but I think uh, CoinDesk did like republish a new policy, so I don't know if their writers aren't allowed or they just disclose it now. But I do try to disclose it. It says like I have some Bitcoin, I think, in most of my author bios. I think as long as you're disclosing it, that's another key point. Like it's one thing to write and like not disclose it at all, but if you're disclosing it, then I think there's really no argument to be made. Like you're obviously trying to be as open and transparent as possible.
Yeah, sure. I agree 100%. And I think the disclosure cuts both ways. I think, and I'm curious to know if you agree, the disclosure should equally apply to journalists who hold Bitcoin and journalists who don't hold Bitcoin. And the reasoning behind this, one of my favorite pundits to read is Matt Levine from Bloomberg. And November maybe, or maybe it was last summer, I can't remember, but when this was sort of a more popular talking point, the owning Bitcoin while writing about it, he said, well, if you don't own Bitcoin, that places you on the exact same coin, just on a different side as far as bias about what you're writing about, as journalists who own Bitcoin and write about it in a positive, with a positive opinion. And especially, he made the point that as Bitcoin adoption becomes or it continues to grow, that a well-balanced index fund or something could inevitably own or have some sort of Bitcoin in it. And if you set up your fund such that, he gave the example of Apple, I think, or maybe Samsung. But if you have your fund such that you own a wide variety of equities, except for one in particular, that places you solidly against that from a sort of reasonable third outside perspective. And so for journalists who hate Bitcoin, if they don't own any, they, in my opinion, should disclose that too, so that we understand the bias that they're writing from, as much as people who own it and write about it too. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you agree?
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think I tweeted out once that like anyone who doesn't own Bitcoin has like, this is when like the block size debate was like really, popping off. I was like, anyone who doesn't own Bitcoin kind of has an incentive to, disrupt the community even further. Even if you look at it from what we were talking about before with people like saying Bitcoin's a scam and stuff like that, and then, just not changing their opinion. That can be a bias as well, even though it's not like you're trying to financially gain from, the what you're writing or whatever like that. It's just like you're preserving your ego or preserving your, your reputation, and just keep saying, because you said Bitcoin was a scam in like 2011 and you don't want to like look like an idiot, and you just keep saying it's a scam just for that reason, because you don't want to admit you were wrong because you think it'll like hurt your reputation or something like that.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me, Kyle. I really appreciate it. Before we go, I guess, any of our listeners can find you on Twitter and find all this information. But before we go, would you mind sharing any upcoming hot takes you're planning on publishing for Forbes or elsewhere, and also where our listeners can follow you, the news you curate, the things you write, and all that sort of thing?
If you just, obviously you can get me on Twitter. I'm there a lot at Kyle Torpey. And then anything else, like my Reddit, my, wherever else, all my articles you can get at kyletorpey.com. And I have them like archived there, kind of just with links to all the sites I write for. I'm not sure what I have on my to-do list to write about, but once it's out, you can find it on the website and on Twitter.
Perfect. Thanks so much, man. This was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
This CoinPod has been a production of You, Me, and BTC. Special thanks to my colleagues Tim Baker and Daniel Brown, and of course to my guest, Kyle. Follow Kyle on Twitter to keep up with all the Bitcoin news you could ever hope to consume. And, as always, follow and message the CoinPod with questions or comments after listening. If you've missed a CoinPod, visit thecoinpod.com to find all of our previous episodes and to learn more about the show. We'll be back next week, so until then, cheers.